Hey everybody, it's Chris from Family Geekery,
And Amber.
and today we're going to be building a computer for Amber. So we've got some parts laid out here. We've got a nice small case, make it easier for her to carry back and forth between college. And we've got a processor and a motherboard picked out. I got a B560 ITX, so the ITX is going to be the small type of motherboard that will fit inside this small little case. And we've got an i5 10400F processor, along with 1 terabyte SSD hard drive, nice and fast and plenty of storage. Got 16 gigs of DDR RAM, and then we got a GTX 1660 GPU. And we picked this GPU because it has to be small. It has to be smaller than like 8 inches in size to fit inside this small little case. So we're going to unbox some of this stuff and get it ready to install. Alright, so when I put a computer together, I always start by bench testing the computer first before we put it in the case. So I build everything onto the motherboard and even power it up and do all my installation of Windows and get everything completely tested before we put it in the case. That way you know that the computer's working before you have to troubleshoot anything once it's all assembled. So Amber's going to be putting this together with me. I'm going to talk her through some of the parts. So let's start off, Amber, with the processor here, the CPU. So we're going to open up the CPU holder there. And lift that bar all the way up. I'm going to open that door, and that black plastic thing should pop off. Okay, you can leave it there for right now.
Okay.
Now if you look, you get the two keys right here, the two notches that make the CPU only go in one particular way. And you're just going to gently place it on top, and I usually give it a tiny wiggle with the top of my finger just to make sure that it's centered.
Like this?
Yep.
Is that
And then,
in?
and then I give it a tiny wiggle like this just to make sure it's not sitting on top of one of the plastic lips. And that's good. Now if you close this down, you bring it down and you hook the thing down, it should pop that plastic up, and it's going to be a hard push. Almost there.
I don't want to break anything.
And then around and down. There you go.
Okay.
And that popped her up.
Cool.
So now the CPU's in there.
And
We're going to
this
hold
is
off a
the
little
whole-
bit on the CPU cooler until we get the RAM installed. So let's go ahead and get the RAM in. I'd start with the one to the left. And you're going to get it right in the slots. Nice and flat. And once you think it's lined up, you're going to press down on one side, click, and then the other side, click.
I don't know.
I'll test it for you.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Crunch. Alright, so when you do that, you'll see that this tab over here has closed.
Okay, yeah.
So we've got one tab open, one tab closed. On this particular motherboard, only the far side opens up. These stay fixed. On some motherboards, both of them open up. It's important to test that first before you start putting it together.
Okay.
So same thing with this one. This one will be a little bit easier because you'll know when it's flat,
Okay.
because it'll be perfectly parallel with the other one.
Was I just not pushing hard enough?
Probably not.
Oh, I don't want to hurt it.
Alright, so you're going to push down on this one until it clicks, and then push on the far one until it clicks. And there we go. And I usually just run my finger over the top like this, just to make sure that everything is parallel, and it looks like everything's perfectly seated. Now we'll know for sure when we boot it up if it doesn't show a full 16 gigs, and then we'll know that we need to maybe reseat one of them. Sometimes you have to just pop them out, pop them back in. Alright, we are ready next for the CPU cooler. Alright, so we've got thermal compound already installed on here. I did a test fit, that's why we see a little bit pushing on there. to show Amber how to do it. So she's going to line up the 4 pegs in the 4 holes of the motherboard. And sometimes you just have to kind of wiggle these around, all 4 of them, until all 4 kind of feel like they're in the holes.
I think so.
Alright. Now what I do is I lift up a little bit on the board and just pop that one in, and then do the opposite one. Make sure it's still lined up in the hole. And then do the last 2. The first 2 will be the harder ones. And I think that one popped up.
Are they all in now?
Alright, so the best way to see if they're all in is we're going to flip it over and look at the plastic pegs. So if it looks like all 4 of the plastic pegs have popped out and have grabbed the board, then it means that they're all in there.
Should I tap it to see if it's in?
No.
Okay.
Alright. And there's no wiggle when I wiggle it, so that feels pretty good. So now we're going to plug in the power cord for this guy. So first you got to find one of these fan headers that says CPU fan. So see if you can see one that says CPU fan. There may be one that says AIO
CPU fan?
or pump.
CPU
Okay.
fan 1?
Yep. So let's take this guy out of here and see if you can put it down. The little spacer here is exactly where that black plastic part right here is going to be. So line it up so that all 4 pins are lined up.
Going to be like this, so that the black can go in between there.
Yep.
Okay, it's kind of a weird. Can I put it in this one?
Which one said CPU fan?
Well, oh, this is CHA fan.
Okay, so that's a chassis fan.
Okay, so it has
So
to
we're
go
going to go
in
to
this
the
one.
CPU fan. Yep.
I don't know if it'll
And if
stretch.
it should.
Okay.
We can take it out of the clip if we want, but if it works right now, then that little clip will give it a little bit of cable management and keep it tidy. And it should, if it's lined up, it should push all the way down flush. And then since they pre-installed this thing around here, I always spin the fan a little bit to make sure that part of the cable isn't coming in, because like right here, if it got any tighter, that might hit, but we'll just keep an eye on that for now. So we've got the CPU, we've got the memory. On this particular motherboard, it does have a spot for an NVMe drive, but we're going to go with a 2.5-inch SATA instead, since I had an extra one that was 1 terabyte. And we're ready to power this thing up in a second. Alright, we've got our cables for the power supply here ready to go. And for this test bench, we're just going to hook up the 24-pin main power, the 8-pin for the CPU power. And when I bench test, I always have just a really low-powered GPU that I can plug in without any power requirements. And we plug that in, get Windows all set up, get everything tested out, and then I install the main GPU into the case once we get that to that part. So here's our 550 watt EVGA fully modular. So we're going to plug in a couple cables into here and then plug them into the motherboard.
Okay.
So we're going to start with the big boy there. And you should have 2 cables here called motherboard, and it should be these 2 guys here. And you're just going to push them straight down, wiggle them a little bit until they clip all the way in. And you can do one at a time if you want.
Is that clipped, or will it clip? Oh, is that it?
They clipped. When they're brand new, sometimes they're a little hard to press in, so I'll just double check. Yep, looks good.
Okay.
Alright, so we'll lay this guy down over here. And the other end of that one, you're going to plug in to the main 24-pin ATX connector. Same thing, goes straight down. Now when you're pushing this one down, you're on top of a cardboard box to give it a little bit of go, so you have to kind of wiggle a little bit until it snaps.
get in. I don't know if I can get the last bit.
Let me double check. Yep, you were pretty close.
Okay.
Alright. Now we're going to do the same thing with the 8 pin. So this one should be labeled CPU on both ends. So CPU 1 here.
Mm-hmm. And the non-split one, right?
Right. Good job.
Easy.
And then just bring that over the top here.
Which side was the lip on? This side?
Yep.
Oh, I think that's it.
Alright, good. So when you're doing these modular cables like this, you always want to make sure that you look at the labels, because you've got 4 pins or 8 pins on this side and 8 pins on this side, which is exactly the same as this cable here, except this is a CPU cable which has 4 and 4 split, and this is a GPU cable which has 6 and 2 split. So you shouldn't be able to plug this one into here because the shapes of these plastic pin holders here, they're different. But if you try to force it in there, you'll probably do some damage. You'll probably get it in there, but it'll probably damage something. So always make sure that you look to see that this is, they usually call it VGA for your GPU. Alright, so we got power, we got processor, we got RAM. We're going to get a couple more things hooked up here, and then we're going to give our first test boot. Okay, we've wired a couple extra things up here. I've got a mouse and keyboard to test. I set up a tiny little monitor here. Always good to have a cheap monitor to test with some things. And this dude right here, this is going to take the place of all the cabling that would normally be inside your chassis. So inside your case has all the button switches for the power button and the reset button. That's what this cable here does. These are pretty handy. You can get them probably for like 10 bucks off of Amazon. And the only thing I've done is I've taken the power switch button and plugged it into the motherboard, into what they call the front panel header. And the front panel header has a bunch of pins for power, for the reset button, for your power light, and for your hard disk activity light. So we don't care about any of that stuff. I just need a button switch. If this is one I was doing on my own, I'd probably just keep this cable off and I'd just short those pins with a knife or a flat blade screwdriver. But I'm trying to do things kind of civilized here today. Alright, so we got the mouse and keyboard plugged into the motherboard itself. And you see here's this cheap little, I think it's a GT710 GPU. And I use that just because it doesn't require any power. I can just test everything. I'll even get Windows all the way up and running on that. And you can actually install the NVIDIA drivers because it isn't an NVIDIA GPU. And then once you plug in the real NVIDIA GPU, then it should pick up those drivers. So we are powered up. I've got the power supply powered up to the wall. I've got the monitor plugged in over here over HDMI. And we are ready to test boot this thing into BIOS. So no hard drive yet. We're just going to go and make sure the BIOS screen looks good. So go ahead and hit that power button and delete. Just start tapping the delete key. And this tells you here, hit the delete key or F2 to get into your BIOS. And there we are. So the BIOS screen is basically just a tiny operating system that's built into the motherboard itself, that you can make some settings to the motherboard and to the peripherals like the CPU and the RAM specifically, and how the hard drive talks and that kind of stuff. And we're just going to use this to verify that the motherboard is all happy with the things that we've installed. So first off, we're going to see here that it does recognize an Intel Core i5-10400F CPU, and it shows the processor speed. It's showing 16 gigs of memory, and it even shows that it is in the 2 DDR slots, Corsair 8GB and 8GB. Right now they're set to 2133 megahertz. That's the speed that they're set, and we can adjust that if we want to. That's called overclocking for this RAM. The BIOS only wants to see it at a certain speed, but we can overclock it later. I usually wait until everything's installed, Windows installed, everything's working right. It runs a day or two with no conflicts or anything before I do any kind of overclocking on the RAM. just to make sure that I don't introduce a problem into the system before I get through what may be a Windows problem. So see, right now we've got nothing hooked up to the SATA drives. That's just because I haven't hooked up the SATA drive yet. That's going to be our hard drive, and I'm not even worried about that. I just want to make sure everything's running good. Here's a running temperature of our CPU. It shows the motherboard temperature at 31 degrees Celsius and the CPU at 36 degrees Celsius. That's good. It's completely unloaded right now, which means it's not thinking. It's just sitting there existing. So 36 is a decent temperature. The ambient room temperature in here is probably 76 to 79 degrees Fahrenheit. So if your ambient room temperature was higher, you can expect your CPU temperature to run higher, because it is going to be dependent on what kind of air it's blowing over the CPU heatsink with that fan. And we see that the CPU fan 1, that was the header that Amber found on there. It's showing the RPM, so 958 RPM, and that's good to note, because we know that the fan is plugged into the right one. The one right next to it was the chassis fan, and we have no chassis fan hooked up yet. That'll eventually be hooked up to the big boy there on the front of the case, and then we'll see some RPMs on that, depending on if we hook it into chassis fan 1 or chassis fan 2. So everything looks good right now, and I think we're ready to load some Windows on this. Alright, to get ready to install Windows, we've got our drive here. We're going to need to hook that up first. So we've got our SATA cable, which came with our motherboard, and I did plug in one more modular cable into our power supply here with the SATA ends on it. So Amber, if you want to attach both the power, and let's go ahead and get this into the motherboard first. So pick one end of those.
They're the same end?
Yep, they're the same on both ends on this one. It usually comes with one cable like that, and then one cable that has a right angle on one end, and just depending on how your case is. And she's plugging into SATA 0, and since it's the only SATA device in the system, there's not going to be any conflict, so she could have picked any one. So go ahead and plug this into the hard drive. So your small cable is always your data, so you line up the L-shape connector, press it on there firmly until it clicks. Good, so that one actually has a locking mechanism. And then the same thing with your power cable. And depending on your power supply, sometimes your power cable has all SATA, sometimes it has SATA and Molex, which is the older style 4-pin connector. You just line up the L.
Let's do this one.
Press it on there until you don't see any gold contacts left. There you go.
Okay.
And then when you look, there's no gold contacts showing. That means it's pressed all the way on. So now we can just let this sit. There's nothing conductive on this. This can just sit anywhere, and there's no moving parts on it since it's all SSD. So we'll just let that flop around there. Once we get into the case, we will mount it to with a couple screws to the case itself. So we are ready. I'm going to pop the switch back on the power supply. And now I've got a Windows boot disk plugged in here. So instead of going into BIOS, we're going to try to get right into the Windows install utility. So we're going to hit the power button, and if we don't see the Windows logo right away, if it goes into BIOS automatically, we'll have to reboot it and start hitting F8, but we're going to see if it picks it up automatically. So hit that power button. And with this Windows boot disk, you usually see the Windows dude spinning there. And there it goes.
Go.
Took a little while to find the drive. And here we go. We're ready to install Windows. So I'm going to take the steering wheel here and go through a couple settings. We're going to keep it on English and US. Install now. And we're going to tell it we don't have a code because we're going to put one in later. I always put it in once Windows is up and running. I'm going to select Windows 10 Home. I'm going to slowly read all of this text here. Okay, you got it?
Oh.
And agree to all that. Now we've got a choice here to do a custom install or upgrade or fix, depending on what your hard drive has on it. If your hard drive's brand new, you got a couple choices. I always do a custom install. And I'm going to take this guy right here. If it had any partitions on it, I would go ahead and delete all the partitions out until it said drive 0, and then everything was just unallocated. At that point, it's ready for me to start installing Windows, and Windows will create all the partitions necessary. There's going to be a boot partition and a recovery partition, and it's going to take care of all that for me. But if this was a used drive that had several partitions on it, you want to wipe all those out first. So you hit next. It's going to copy some files on here, and we'll come back when that's done. Alright, so everything loaded up, and now it's doing its first reboot. And then after it gets through this reboot, it's going to go through the actual Windows setup screen. So this would be what you'd see if you bought a brand new computer and Windows was preloaded on there, but then you have to personalize it to yourself. And there's one little trick on this that I like, is if you don't have your internet hooked up, whether you're using Wi-Fi, it's going to give us an option to hook up Wi-Fi or an Ethernet cable. Don't have that hooked up when this is going on. If you have that hooked up, it's going to force you to create or use your Microsoft account. And if you don't want to do that right away, if you have the internet unplugged, then it gives you an option to say, hey, I don't have internet now, let me set that up later. I always do that just to keep a couple steps out of this part here. And that way you don't have to log into Windows with a PIN or with a Microsoft password. You can just create a local user account. You can still use your Microsoft account in the Microsoft Store inside Windows. It doesn't stop you from doing that. It just stops you from having to log in with your Microsoft account. Alright, so here we are. We're going to select United States, US keyboard. We're going to skip the second keyboard. Here's where it says, hey, you can hook up to Wi-Fi because you have a Wi-Fi card, but I'm going to click on I do not have internet down in the bottom left-hand corner. On this guy, it's going to say, hey, if you don't hook up with a Microsoft account, you're going to miss out on some stuff. So you just say continue without it. We can set that up later if we want to. So this is where we can actually give the account a local Microsoft or local account versus a Microsoft account. So Amber, if you want to just type in your name there. And we're going to just skip the password for now, and you can add that later. This lets us boot up a couple times. We're going to have to reboot it several times. It lets us reboot without having to put in a password. All this stuff I usually just keep default unless there's a specific reason that I don't want to share my location or share my advertising IDs. Most of the stuff I just leave default and just hit install. I'm going to say not now for Cortana. We don't need you, Cortana.
Hi.
And this is going to configure the rest of Windows, and the next thing that we'll see when this is all done is the Windows desktop. So we'll come back when we see that. Alright, so Windows finished installing, and now we're at the Windows desktop. So I'm going to have Amber check a couple things. Hit on the keyboard there, hold down Control, Shift, and Escape. Alright. Now from this is your Task Manager. That's just a shortcut to get to Task Manager. Click on Performance tab. This shows you your CPU, so if you click on your CPU, it just verifies that is the i5-10400F. Click on Memory, and it shows you that there are two slots used, so you have dual channels set up. And it still shows the 2133 megahertz because we haven't overclocked it in the BIOS yet, but that's good. So it's showing the full 16 gigs. Before we checked that the BIOS saw all the memory and everything. Now we're making sure that Windows sees it all. So click on the C drive. It shows that it's SSD. That's 1 terabyte. Ethernet is, it found the drivers for Ethernet. and then the GPU. We haven't downloaded the NVIDIA drivers yet, but it did find this as a GT710, so we're good to go there. Alright, you can close that out.
Sandwiches. Sorry.
Squirrel. Alright, now click down into your search bar and just type in the word device. Now you see device manager there, click on that. And this shows all the devices that are in your computer, and it shows if the driver's missing or not. So we see there's 3 things on there that the driver is missing. It's got the little yellow exclamation point. That just means that the Windows pre-install didn't have those drivers built into it, and they didn't get picked up with the first update through Windows Update. So we're going to have to download those manually, but that's easy enough to do. We're going to do that off camera, but I'll show you how to do that. If you click on your tab, your internet tab down at the bottom.
Edge?
Yeah, click on Edge.
Okay.
So here's the website. Go ahead and click got it on that, or close that out. Here's the website for the motherboard that we did, the ASRock B560M-ITX AEC. And if you scroll down a little bit, there's always going to be a support tab, and that support tab is going to have downloads. So if you scroll down that download list there, sometimes the words that they use on these drivers don't match the words that are in Device Manager, and you got to do a little bit of trial and error. But basically you would find the drivers that didn't get pre-installed, and you would download those, install them, and then that will clean up that Device Manager. So when you're loading Windows for the first time, you do that a couple times. It makes you reboot a couple times, and then hopefully by the end of it, your Device Manager looks completely clean. So we'll do that off camera, and we'll get Windows completely updated. So the last thing we'll have to do, now that we've got this computer all up and running, this is basically your whole computer here minus the case.
Woo!
Is we're going to put this in the case, and we're not going to do that on camera because it's just a lot of tedious putting your hands into small areas and losing screws several times. So I'll put all that together, make it all nice and pretty, and then we'll come back when that's all done. Alright, so here she is, all put together. This is the Cooler Master case that we picked out. Nice and small. It's got a built-in handle back here to grab it also. It's got a 200mm RGB fan that's addressable in the motherboard using a utility. And everything came up. We had to load a couple drivers on there from Windows. Had to download some from the ASRock site, which is the motherboard manufacturer. And once we got all those drivers loaded in there, it's all done. And ready to load a bunch of games on. So what do you think, Amber?
It's pretty. I like it. Nice and small.
Yeah, it's nice. Alright, well, we hope you enjoyed this video, putting this computer together. If you have any questions about assembling computers, I've been doing this for about 30 years. So just throw me a comment down below if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. Until next time, guys, peace out and geek out.